Shadows of the past. Thunder rumbled over the sprawling skyline of New York City, rattling the thick glass windows of Maverick Innovations headquarters. Inside the top-floor office, Zane Maverick Sterling stood in silence, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored suit. The rain streaked down the windows, mirroring the turmoil in his heart. At just 31, Zane had built a technological empire from the ground up. His company, Maverick Innovations, had revolutionized artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and digital commerce, earning him billions. But all the wealth in the world couldn't shake the emptiness that had taken root in his chest. On his sleek mahogany desk, a single photograph sat framed in silver, its edges worn from years of handling. It was the only relic from a past he rarely spoke of, a past that still haunted him no matter how far he ran. The image captured a young woman with flowing auburn hair and piercing emerald eyes, her smile radiant with life. Sarah. 10 years had passed since he had last seen her, 10 years since he had lost the only woman he had ever truly loved. Zane let out a heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He had long accepted that he wasn't destined for family, for love, or for a legacy beyond his business. The doctors had confirmed it when he was 25. He couldn't have children. Some cruel twist of fate had denied him the ability to pass on his name, his bloodline. And yet, for the past few weeks, something strange had been happening. His usually quiet life had been disrupted by a bizarre series of encounters. He had seen children, twin girls, no older than 6, multiple times around the city. The first time was at a charity gala, where he had caught a glimpse of them standing near the catering table, whispering to each other. The second time was in Central Park. They had been playing near a fountain when one of them had dropped her stuffed rabbit. When he had bent to pick it up, they had stared at him with wide, familiar eyes before running away. But what had shaken him the most was what he had seen the night before. At a private auction event for one of his business ventures, Zane had been speaking with investors when he noticed the girls again. They were standing near the exit, dressed in simple coats, their small hands clasped together. Something about them felt unsettlingly familiar. Then he had seen it, the small silver ring hanging on a chain around one of the girls' necks. His breath had caught in his throat. It was the exact same ring he had given Sarah a decade ago. A wave of emotions had crashed over him so violently that he had excused himself from the event immediately. He had searched the venue for the children, but by the time he reached the exit, they had disappeared into the night. Now, standing alone in his office, Zane felt the weight of a past he had tried to bury clawing its way to the surface. He clenched his fists, his heart hammering in his chest. Could it be? Was it possible that he had been lied to? That Sarah had hidden something from him all those years ago? A sharp knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice rough. The door swung open to reveal his personal assistant, Claire Donovan. Sharp, efficient, and always impeccably dressed, Claire had been his right-hand woman for the past 5 years. She knew him better than most. "Sir, I have the background check results you requested," she said, stepping inside and placing a folder on his desk. Zane exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. After last night, he hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was off. He had tasked Claire with finding out everything she could about the twin girls. He picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside were 2 profiles, one for each girl. Amelia and Evelyn Brooks. Age: 6. Orphaned. Currently staying at West Haven Children's Shelter. Zane's eyes darted to the section labeled Parents. His breath hitched when he read the name listed under Mother. Sarah Brooks. Deceased. His heart stopped. The room felt like it was spinning, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like an avalanche. Sarah had children. Sarah had his children. And she was gone. For a long moment, he just stared at the paper, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. His chest felt like it was being crushed under the force of 1,000 emotions: shock, grief, anger. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she hidden this from him? "Sir." Claire's voice was softer now, more cautious. "Are you all right?" Zane forced himself to take a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the folder. He turned to Claire, his voice low but firm. "Get my car ready," he said. "I need to see them." Claire hesitated for only a second before nodding. Of course. As she exited the office, Zane gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady himself. He had spent the past 10 years believing he had no family. Now 2 little girls were out there, his daughters, and he was going to find out everything. The face of destiny. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle by the time Zane's sleek black Bentley pulled up in front of West Haven Children's Shelter. The building stood in stark contrast to the towering skyscrapers he was accustomed to, a worn brick structure with peeling white paint and a rusted gate that creaked against the wind. Zane sat motionless in the back seat, his fingers drumming against his knee. His heart pounded, something foreign and unfamiliar clawing at his chest. Fear, anticipation, a storm of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Claire, sitting beside him, glanced up from her tablet. "Are you sure about this?" Zane exhaled through his nose. Was he? He had spent the past decade believing he would never have a family, that the idea of fatherhood was an impossibility. And now, 2 little girls, his daughters. He clenched his jaw. Yes. The driver opened the door, and Zane stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket. The shelter looked even more run down up close. A broken swing swayed in the yard, and the faint laughter of children echoed from inside. With long, purposeful strides, he walked up the steps and knocked firmly on the door. A few seconds later, it creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled into a messy bun. She squinted up at him, clearly not expecting a billionaire in a 3-piece suit to be standing on her doorstep. "Can I help you?" she asked, crossing her arms. Zane straightened. "My name is Zane Sterling. I believe you have 2 girls in your care, Amelia and Evelyn Brooks." The woman's eyes darkened with suspicion. "And what is your relation to them?" He hesitated, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. I believe I'm their father." The woman, who introduced herself as Miss Callahan, studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Zane entered the shelter, immediately noticing the stark difference from his own world. The walls were painted a dull beige, lined with chipped wooden furniture and shelves of donated books. Children's voices filled the air, but beneath their laughter was an unshakable sense of loneliness. Miss Callahan led him through a narrow hallway. "Amelia and Evelyn arrived here 6 months ago," she explained. "Their mother, Sarah, passed away unexpectedly. No known relatives came forward." Zane swallowed hard, forcing down the sharp sting in his chest. 6 months. His children had been alone for 6 months while he had been living in luxury, unaware of their existence. Miss Callahan stopped outside a door and knocked softly before pushing it open. The room was small, lined with bunk beds, a few scattered toys, and a single window overlooking the street. And there, huddled together on one of the lower bunks, were the 2 girls. Zane felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. They were identical, both with dark chestnut hair and piercing green eyes, Sarah's eyes. But it wasn't just their resemblance to their mother that struck him. It was the familiarity, the unshakable connection he felt just looking at them. Evelyn, the braver of the 2, was the first to look up. Her gaze met his, filled with a guarded curiosity. Amelia clutched a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest, pressing closer to her sister. Miss Callahan cleared her throat. "Girls, this man is—" "I know him," Evelyn interrupted. Zane's brows furrowed. "You do?" Miss Callahan blinked in surprise. Evelyn nodded slowly, tilting her head. "You're the man from the pictures." Zane's heart stopped. "What pictures?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Amelia, still clutching her rabbit, mumbled, "Mama had pictures of you in her box." Zane felt as though the ground beneath him had vanished. Sarah had kept pictures of him. Evelyn studied him carefully, her small fingers reaching up to grasp the chain around her neck. A silver ring dangled from it. The ring. Zane swallowed hard. Where did you get that? Evelyn's grip on the ring tightened. It was Mama's. She said it was special. Something in Zane broke. He had thought he was prepared for this moment, but nothing could have braced him for the reality of it. For the realization that Sarah had never truly left him behind. Ms. Callahan sighed. The girls haven't spoken much about their mother's passing, but they've always been different, like they were waiting for someone. Zane knelt down, leveling himself with the girls. He hesitated. How was he supposed to tell them? To explain everything in a way that wouldn't overwhelm them. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. Are you here to take us away? Zane's breath hitched. Was he? His entire life, he had built walls around himself, convinced he was better off alone. But looking at them now, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Yes, he said finally, his voice steady. If you'll let me. Amelia looked uncertain, gripping her rabbit even tighter, but Evelyn studied him with careful intensity. How do we know you won't leave? She asked. Zane felt something in his chest tighten painfully. I won't, he promised. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Amelia before nodding once. Zane exhaled, a strange warmth settling in his chest. He had found them, and he wasn't going to lose them again. A promise in the dark. The drive back to Zane's penthouse was silent. The two small figures sitting in the back seat of his Bentley seemed impossibly fragile in the vast luxury of the car's interior. Evelyn sat upright, her green eyes flickering with cautious curiosity as she stared out the window at the city lights. Amelia, on the other hand, was curled against her sister, clutching her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. Zane gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his mind spinning. He had walked into West Haven Children's Shelter expecting answers. Instead, he had walked out with a responsibility he had never imagined. His daughters were sitting in his car. His daughters. The words still felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else's life. Not his. Not the life he had spent years meticulously building. One of control, of power, of solitude. But then Evelyn shifted, her tiny fingers grazing the ring she wore on a chain around her neck, and everything inside him tightened. Sarah had kept his ring. She had never told him about the girls, never reached out, never given him the chance to know them. And now she was gone, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and two children who didn't even know what it meant to be safe. He stole a glance at them through the rearview mirror. Amelia's small hands were gripping the edge of her coat, her lower lip trembling slightly. He wasn't blind the way she kept sneaking glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Evelyn, however, met his gaze directly. You don't talk much, she finally said, breaking the silence. Zane blinked. The straightforwardness of the comment caught him off guard. Neither do you, he countered. Evelyn narrowed her eyes at him. We're kids. You're an adult. Adults usually ask a lot of questions. A ghost of a smile tugged at Zane's lips. She was sharp. What should I be asking? He mused, keeping his tone light. Evelyn shrugged. I don't know. Maybe stuff like, what's our favorite color? Or what do we like to eat? Zane considered this. He had spent years negotiating billion-dollar deals, but the idea of making conversation with a 6-year-old felt like an impossible challenge. What's your favorite color? He asked, feeling ridiculous. Evelyn crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed with his attempt. Purple. He glanced at Amelia. And you? The little girl hesitated before whispering. Blue. Zane nodded as if filing the information away. He paused before asking, And what do you like to eat? Evelyn answered without hesitation. Pancakes, but only the ones with chocolate chips. Amelia gave a tiny nod. Me too. Pancakes. He could work with that. As they pulled up to his penthouse building, Zane turned off the ignition and turned to face them fully. We're here. Evelyn leaned over to peer out the window. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the sheer height of the building. Amelia shrank back, gripping her rabbit even tighter. The doorman was already holding the door open as Zane led them into the lobby. The vast marble floors gleamed under golden chandeliers, and the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne lingered in the air. Evelyn let out a low whistle. "Are we in a castle?" Zane almost laughed. "No." Amelia's small voice piped up. "It looks like one." He glanced down at them, unsure of what to say. He had spent years hosting executives, investors, and world leaders in this very building, but now, two tiny figures were staring up at him as if he were some kind of mythical creature. He wasn't sure how to feel about that. The elevator ride up was quiet again, but Zane could feel the weight of their unspoken questions pressing against him. When the doors slid open to reveal his penthouse, Amelia let out a tiny gasp. The space was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, casting a soft glow across sleek leather furniture and modern decor. The open floor plan led into a kitchen that was lined with the latest technology, though Zane barely used it. Evelyn marched forward, her tiny sneakers squeaking against the marble floor as she surveyed the space like a detective. "Do you live here alone?" Zane nodded. "Yes." "Why?" He hesitated. "Because that's how it's always been." Evelyn gave him a look he didn't quite understand. "That's sad." Zane wasn't sure how to respond to that. Amelia, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, looked around hesitantly before whispering, "It's really big." Zane noticed how small she seemed in the vastness of his home. "It doesn't have to feel big," he said softly. The words surprised even him. Amelia peeked up at him through long lashes. "Are we staying here?" Zane hesitated. He had made a promise, but saying it out loud felt terrifyingly permanent. "If you want to," he said finally. Amelia bit her lip, considering before nodding. Evelyn, however, was watching him carefully. "And you're not going to disappear?" The question sent an unexpected stab of pain through him. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I won't." Evelyn studied him for a long moment before nodding, as if coming to her own conclusion. "Okay." The weight of that one word settled deep in Zane's chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone. And neither did they. A father's first dawn. Zane woke up to the unfamiliar sound of soft murmuring. For years, the only thing that filled the vast silence of his penthouse was the occasional hum of his security system, or the soft clicking of his watch against his nightstand. But today the air was alive with hushed voices, rustling blankets, and tiny feet padding against the polished wooden floors. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that everything that had happened yesterday wasn't some strange fever dream. Sarah's twin daughters, his daughters, they were here, in his home, in his life. He exhaled, pressing a hand against his face before pushing himself up. The morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden streaks across the room. He wasn't sure what he expected to feel: fear, uncertainty, regret. Instead, there was only a quiet, cautious sense of something. Purpose. He got out of bed, tugging on a gray t-shirt and sweatpants before heading toward the source of the noise. The girls' room, formerly one of his massive guest suites, was partially open. He had spent the night before hastily instructing his assistant, Claire, to get it furnished with whatever was necessary. New beds, stuffed animals, clothes, books. He had no idea what kids liked, but Claire was efficient. The room had been transformed overnight into something softer, warmer, a place meant for children, not for corporate executives. He paused just outside the doorway. Inside, Evelyn and Amelia sat cross-legged on their new bed, whispering to each other. Evelyn was holding up a small picture book, while Amelia was clutching the ever-present stuffed rabbit. They were still in their new pajamas, Amelia in soft blue, Evelyn in purple. For a moment, Zane simply watched them. They were small, so much smaller than he had realized yesterday, and fragile in a way that had nothing to do with their size. Evelyn was the first to notice him. She looked up, eyes sharp and observant. "You look different." Zane raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Evelyn studied him for a moment before shrugging. "Less scary." Zane blinked. He hadn't realized he had been scary to them in the first place. Amelia peeked up at him, but didn't say anything. She still seemed wary, as if she wasn't sure he was real or just another fleeting presence in her life. Zane cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward. "Are you hungry?" Evelyn perked up. "Depends. Do you have pancakes?" A challenge. Zane crossed his arms. "I can have my chef make some." Evelyn's nose scrunched. "That's cheating." Zane arched a brow. "How is that cheating?" She tilted her head. "Because real dads make pancakes, not chefs." A strange emotion pulled at Zane's chest. Real dads. The phrase felt foreign, like it didn't belong to him. Still, he wasn't about to lose a challenge to a 6-year-old. "Fine," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll make them." Evelyn's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Do you even know how?" Zane turned on his heel, heading toward the kitchen. "We'll find out." Behind him, Evelyn giggled. Amelia, surprisingly, let out a tiny giggle of her own. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and something inside him knew. He wanted to hear it again. Zane had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. He had led some of the most brilliant minds in the tech industry, made game-changing decisions that altered the landscape of modern technology. But at this moment, standing in his sleek, state-of-the-art kitchen with flour on his hands and batter dripping onto his marble countertop, he had never felt more out of his depth. Evelyn and Amelia sat on the bar stools, watching him like judges on a cooking show. Zane frowned at the lumpy batter in the bowl. "This doesn't look right." Evelyn smirked. "Did you follow the recipe?" Zane glanced at the tablet propped against the counter, which displayed a basic pancake recipe. He had read it. He just hadn't measured anything exactly. "I improvised," he admitted. Evelyn gasped dramatically. "You can't just improvise pancakes." Amelia let out another small giggle, though she quickly hid her face behind her rabbit. Zane sighed. "All right. Fine. I'll do it again." He expected Evelyn to tease him, but instead, she slid off the stool and pulled a step stool closer. "I'll help." Zane watched as she confidently poured the correct amount of flour into the bowl, then gestured for Amelia to come over. After a moment of hesitation, Amelia slid off her stool and climbed onto the step stool next to her sister. Zane handed her the measuring cup. "You want to help too?" Amelia nodded shyly. And so, for the next 20 minutes, Zane Sterling, the same man who had once been named Forbes' most eligible billionaire, stood in his million-dollar kitchen, making pancakes with 2 6-year-olds. The first batch was burnt. The second was slightly better. By the third, they had somehow managed to create something edible. When the pancakes were finally stacked on plates, Zane watched as the girls took their first bites. Amelia's eyes widened. "It's good." Evelyn grinned. "Told you we could fix it." Zane leaned back against the counter, watching them. This was new, unfamiliar, terrifying, but also something else, something he wasn't ready to name just yet. Evelyn looked up at him suddenly. "Hey, Zane." He arched a brow at her casual use of his name. She hesitated for a moment before asking, "Are you going to be our dad now?" Silence filled the space between them. Zane had no answer, because for the first time in his life, the future was something he couldn't calculate, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. The weight of a name. Zane had never been the kind of man to hesitate. Every decision in his life had been calculated, precise, and without regret. It was how he had built his empire, how he had turned Sterling Tech into a billion-dollar powerhouse, and how he had ensured that no one could ever control this fate. But Evelyn's question, "Are you going to be our dad now?" had left him completely speechless. He had spent the last 24 hours adjusting to the fact that he even had daughters, that Sarah had kept them from him, that the two small girls sitting at his kitchen counter, eating the pancakes they had helped him fix, were now looking at him like he was supposed to have all the answers. But he didn't. Zane took a slow breath and set his coffee cup down, leaning against the counter. Evelyn's green eyes, so much like Sarah's, watched him carefully, waiting for a response. Amelia, quieter but no less observant, hugged her stuffed rabbit to her chest. This wasn't a business deal. This wasn't a negotiation. This was two children, fragile and uncertain, asking him for something far greater than money or security. Zane met Evelyn's gaze. "I don't know what being a dad is supposed to look like." Evelyn frowned. "What do you mean?" Zane hesitated before answering. "I never had one." Silence. Evelyn tilted her head, her brows furrowing. Amelia's grip on her stuffed rabbit tightened. Zane exhaled. "My parents died when I was very young. I grew up alone." Evelyn's lips pressed together. "Like us?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. No, not like them. Because as alone as Zane had been in his childhood, bouncing between foster homes, learning to trust no one, he had never known what it was like to lose a mother who had loved him, to lose the only person in the world who had made him feel safe. Evelyn and Amelia had lost Sarah, and whether or not he had been ready for it, they were looking at him now. Zane cleared his throat. "I can't promise I'll be good at it," he admitted, "but if you want me to be here, I will be." Evelyn studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Okay, just like that. No contracts, no negotiations, no conditions." Zane wasn't sure if he had ever agreed to anything so important in such a simple way. Amelia, who had been silent for most of the conversation, peeked up at him. "So, do we call you Dad?" Zane stiffened. He hadn't even thought about that. Evelyn smirked. "Zane's kind of a cool name. We could just keep calling you that." Zane let out a short, amused breath. "That's up to you." Evelyn exchanged a glance with Amelia. The younger twin seemed nervous, but she whispered, "Maybe someday." Something in Zane's chest tightened. Someday. He could live with that. Someday. Zane had never paid much attention to weekends before. His life was structured in such a way that it didn't matter what day of the week it was. Meetings, projects, deadlines, deals. Time was just a currency to be managed. But now, standing in the middle of a department store with two 6-year-olds debating the merits of a purple hoodie versus a blue one, he realized that time had taken on an entirely new shape. "This one has pockets," Evelyn said, holding up the purple hoodie. "But this one has stars," Amelia countered, gripping the blue one. Zane exhaled slowly, feeling completely out of his depth. He had no problem spending money. He had built an empire on understanding investments. But this was different. Claire had offered to take the girls shopping for him, but Zane had refused. He didn't know why, but something about letting someone else handle it felt wrong. So here he was, standing in a children's clothing section, trying to make sense of an argument about stars versus pockets. Evelyn turned to him. "Which one do you think is better?" Zane arched a brow. "What's the difference?" Both girls groaned in unison. Amelia clutched the blue hoodie to her chest. "This one has stars. It's like the night sky." Evelyn pointed at the purple one. "But this one has deep pockets. You can carry stuff." Zane considered the options. "Why not both?" Evelyn gasped dramatically. "That's cheating." Zane smirked. "Why? Who made the rules?" Amelia giggled. Evelyn did. Evelyn placed her hands on her hips. "Fine. I guess you can buy both." Zane shook his head in amusement and handed the items to the cashier. As they walked out of the store, he noticed how easily Evelyn slipped her hand into Amelia's, how they never strayed too far from each other. They had spent their entire lives relying only on each other. Zane had spent his entire life relying on no one. But now, there was an unspoken shift. And for the first time in years, he wasn't just thinking about himself. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep in their new beds, Zane stood in the doorway of their room, watching them. Amelia had curled up beneath her blue star-covered blanket, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Evelyn was sprawled out, her purple hoodie draped over her like an extra layer of comfort. Zane leaned against the doorframe. He had spent his entire adult life building things, companies, wealth, power. But this was something he had no blueprint for. And yet, as he stood there, listening to their quiet breathing, he realized, for the first time in his life, he had something worth protecting. A name worth keeping. Zane had built an empire by controlling everything. His time, his decisions, his emotions. But fatherhood, that wasn't something he could control. It was unpredictable, messy, uncharted territory. And yet, as he stood at the kitchen island, watching Evelyn and Amelia argue over whether waffles or pancakes were the superior breakfast, he realized something. He didn't want control over this. He just wanted to be here. For them. Evelyn tapped her spoon against the counter. Okay, Zane. Settle the debate. Pancakes or waffles? Zane, who had barely taken a sip of his morning coffee, raised a brow. Didn't we just go through this with hoodies? Evelyn groaned. That was different. This is serious. Amelia, who had grown more comfortable over the last few days, whispered, waffles are better. They hold the syrup. Evelyn crossed her arms. Pancakes are fluffier. Zane pretended to think about it. Both. You. Evelyn threw her hands up. You always do that. Zane smirked. Because it works. Amelia giggled, and Zane felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. The sound was still new. Her laughter, her voice. She had been the quieter one, slower to trust. But every day, she let her guard down a little more. They both did. And he wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere between burnt pancakes, late-night story times, and navigating twin debates, they had become his. Not just as a responsibility, but as a family, a home. Later that day, as Zane was in his office finishing up work, he heard a knock on the door. Evelyn peeked her head in. Can we come in? Zane set down his pen. Of course. She stepped inside, Amelia right behind her. There was something different about their energy, less playful, more hesitant. Evelyn glanced at Amelia, then back at him. We have a question. Zane leaned back in his chair, curious. All right. Amelia fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. It's about our last name. Zane's breath stilled. Evelyn took a deep breath, then said, At the shelter, we were just called Evelyn and Amelia Rivers. That was Mum's last name. She hesitated. But we gon' have to keep it, right? Zane's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. He knew where this was going, and he wasn't sure he was ready. Evelyn bit her lip. We were thinking, maybe we could have your last name. Zane's chest tightened. Sterling. His name. The name he had built from nothing. The name that had meant strength and power for as long as he could remember. A name that no one had ever shared with him. And now, these two little girls, his daughters, wanted to take it as their own. Are you sure? He asked, his voice quieter than usual. Evelyn nodded, her green eyes steady. You said you wouldn't disappear. Zane swallowed. I won't. Amelia looked up at him. Then, can we be Amelia and Evelyn Sterling? Zane felt something shift inside him. Something permanent. Something right. He stood, walking over to where they stood. He crouched slightly so he was at their level. If that's what you both want, then yes. Amelia smiled softly. Evelyn grinned. Good, because Sterling sounds way cooler than Rivers. Zane chuckled, ruffling her hair. Glad to hear it. Evelyn grabbed Amelia's hand, then looked up at him again. "You know, we still might call you Zane for a while." Zane smirked. "I figured. But someday," she said, her voice softer, more serious, "we might call you Dad." Zane's heart clenched. Someday. He could wait. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone anymore. And neither were they. They were Sterling's now.